The nurse's hand trembled as she held the marriage certificate. In 48 hours, her best friend would be buried, and she would become a widow to a man she'd never kissed. Before you judge this story, hear me out until the very end, because sometimes the deepest love stories don't look anything like we expect them to. If this touches your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like these need to be shared. Now, let me tell you about Sarah, Marcus, and Emma, and a promise that changed everything. Sarah had known Emma since they were 7 years old, sharing scraped knees, first crushes, and dreams whispered under blanket forts. They were more than best friends. They were sisters by choice, the kind of bond that people spend lifetimes searching for. So when Emma met Marcus at a hospital charity gala where she volunteered, Sarah was the first person she called, breathless with excitement about the kind-eyed surgeon who made her laugh until her stomach hurt. Sarah watched them fall in love with the pure joy of someone who genuinely celebrates another's happiness. She was there for every milestone, the nervous first date, the weekend trip where Marcus fumbled the proposal by dropping the ring in a fountain, the wedding where Sarah stood as maid of honor, tears streaming down her face as she watched her best friend marry her soulmate. She had never seen Emma so radiant, so completely herself. 3 years into their marriage, Emma started getting headaches. Nothing serious, she insisted, probably just stress from her new teaching position. But Marcus, with his medical training, noticed the subtle changes. The slight confusion when she forgot common words. The way she'd pause mid-sentence, searching for thoughts that seemed to slip away. He insisted on tests, trying to keep the worry from his voice. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Glioblastoma, stage 4, inoperable. Emma was 32 years old, and the doctors gave her maybe 18 months, probably less. Sarah's world shattered that day, but she knew it was nothing compared to what Emma and Marcus faced. She took a leave from her job as a graphic designer and moved into their guest room without being asked. She learned to hide her tears, to be strong when Emma needed strength, to laugh when laughter felt impossible. The months that followed were brutal. Emma fought with everything she had, enduring treatments that ravaged her body while stealing precious time. Marcus worked reduced hours, spending every possible moment with his wife. And Sarah was there through it all, holding Emma's hand during chemotherapy, researching experimental treatments at 3 in the morning, and pretending not to notice when Marcus would break down in the hallway, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It was during one of those late nights, when Emma was finally sleeping after hours of pain, that Marcus and Sarah first really talked. They sat in the dimly lit kitchen, exhausted and terrified, and discovered they shared the same helpless fury at a universe that could be so cruel. They became anchors for each other, two people drowning in the same grief, trying desperately to stay afloat for the person they both loved more than life itself. 14 months after diagnosis, Emma's condition deteriorated rapidly. The tumors were growing faster than anyone anticipated. She was admitted to hospice care with maybe 2 weeks left. That's when she called them both to her bedside, her once vibrant face now gaunt but her eyes still sharp with determination. What she asked them seemed impossible, insane. She wanted Marcus to marry Sarah, not after she died but before. She wanted Sarah to become Marcus's wife while Emma was still alive to see it happen. Sarah's first reaction was horror. She stood up so fast she knocked over her chair, backing away as if Emma had suggested something obscene. Marcus looked like he'd been struck, his face pale and confused. But Emma, weak as she was, wouldn't let it go. She explained with the clarity of someone who had spent months thinking about nothing else. Marcus would be destroyed by her death. She knew him, knew how deeply he felt things, how he internalized pain. He would shut down, shut everyone out, and slowly disappear into his grief. He needed someone who understood what they'd been through. Someone who loved him not as a replacement, but as a companion in survival. Someone he already trusted completely. And Sarah, sweet Sarah, who gave everything to everyone else, needed someone to take care of her for once. Someone who would make sure she didn't lose herself in service to others. Someone who understood the depth of loss she was facing because he was facing it too. Emma wasn't asking them to fall in love. She was asking them to save each other from drowning. She was giving them permission to lean on each other, to build something new from the ashes of what they were losing. And she wanted, more than anything, to see Marcus married to someone she knew would honor his heart. But there was more. Emma had a life insurance policy through her teaching position, substantial and with a clause that would only pay full benefits to a surviving spouse. Marcus alone would receive it automatically, but Emma's wish was that half of it go to Sarah, who had sacrificed her career, her savings, and her own life for the past year. The only way to ensure Sarah would be protected, that she wouldn't emerge from this tragedy financially destroyed, was if she was legally Marcus's spouse when Emma passed. The conversation that followed was agonizing. Sarah refused, repeatedly, her voice breaking as she insisted she wouldn't betray Emma like this. Marcus sat silent, torn between honoring his dying wife's wishes and the wrongness of everything about the situation. Emma, exhausted but relentless, asked Sarah one simple question. If their positions were reversed, wouldn't Sarah want to know Marcus would be? Okay? Wouldn't she want to give him that gift? Sarah left the room sobbing. She drove aimlessly for hours, her phone buzzing with ignored calls. She ended up at the park where she and Emma used to play as children, sitting on a swing set in the dark, trying to understand how loving someone could lead to something so complicated and painful. Marcus found her there near midnight. He sat on the swing beside her, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally, he said he couldn't ask this of her. It was too much, too strange, too painful. But he also admitted that Emma understood something he was afraid to face. He was barely holding on, and when Emma died, he didn't know if he'd survive his own grief. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet way people disappear, going through motions until there's nothing left. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw her own devastation reflected back. She saw her best friend's husband, yes, but also the man who had held her when she broke down at 2 a.m, who made terrible jokes to make her smile, who understood her grief because he lived in it too. She saw someone who needed saving as much as she did. They returned to the hospice together at dawn. Emma was awake, had been awake all night according to the nurse, waiting. Sarah sat beside the bed, took her best friend's frail hand, and asked if Emma was absolutely sure. Emma smiled, the shadow of her old brilliant smile, and said she'd never been more certain of anything. The wedding happened 3 days later in Emma's hospice room. A chaplain officiated, clearly uncomfortable but moved by Emma's determination. There were no white dresses, no flowers, no celebration. Emma, barely conscious, watched from her bed as Sarah and Marcus exchanged vows that felt both sacred and surreal. They promised to honor each other, to support each other, to face the darkness together. They didn't promise to love each other romantically. That wasn't what this was. Emma signed as a witness to her own husband's remarriage. She whispered to Sarah afterward that she could rest now, knowing they'd be okay. She told Marcus she loved him more than words could hold. And then, surrounded by the 2 people who loved her most, Emma closed her eyes. She died 48 hours later with both of them holding her hands. The weeks after were a blur of grief. They planned a funeral that celebrated Emma's light. They held each other through panic attacks and sleepless nights. They existed in a strange limbo, legally married but emotionally shattered, 2 survivors clinging to the same piece of wreckage. Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. Not a marriage in the traditional sense, at least not at first, but a partnership forged in the deepest loss. They learned each other's rhythms of grief. Marcus would cook when Sarah couldn't get out of bed. Sarah would sit with Marcus when nightmares woke him screaming. They talked about Emma constantly, keeping her alive in stories and memories, refusing to let grief erase her vibrancy. Months passed, then a year. They scattered Emma's ashes in the places she loved most. They started the Emma Chen Memorial Scholarship for aspiring teachers. And somewhere in the process of healing together, something unexpected happened. Not a betrayal of Emma, but an evolution of the foundation she'd built for them. They fell in love. Not the passionate whirlwind Emma and Marcus had shared, but something quieter, deeper. A love built on truly seeing each other's worst moments and choosing to stay. A love that honored grief rather than running from it. A love that Emma, in her wisdom, had somehow known was possible. 2 years after Emma's death, on what would have been her 35th birthday, Sarah and Marcus renewed their vows. This time it was a choice, not a desperate gift from a dying woman, but a commitment born from understanding that love doesn't follow rules. That sometimes the most profound connections grow from the deepest pain. That honoring someone's memory doesn't mean freezing yourself in the moment you lost them. Standing at Emma's grave afterward, Sarah whispered a thank you to her best friend, for knowing them better than they knew themselves, for having the courage to give an impossible gift, for teaching them that love multiplies rather than divides, that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings rise from the most devastating endings. If you're still watching, thank you for hearing this story without judgment. Life is rarely simple, and love is even more complex. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept the gifts we're given, even when they come wrapped in pain. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in the healing power of unconventional love stories. And remember that grief and joy can coexist, that honoring the past doesn't mean sacrificing the future, and that sometimes the deepest love means letting go while holding on. Emma knew that. And in teaching them, she gave Sarah and Marcus not just each other, but permission to live fully again. That's the greatest love story of all.